I'm Dr. Thomas Smith. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Geography and Environment at LSE. I come from a physical geography background. I teach climate change and environmental change at the LSE, and my area of research is wildfires. And I spent most of my career so far measuring the content of the smoke from wildfires. And but I'm going to talk today a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing on European wildfires and a little bit on UK wildfires as well. I know most people in the room are not from the UK, but it's becoming an increasing. The UK is a really interesting case study for wildfires because we didn't really have many of them in the past, and what you might have seen in the news that we had some devastating wildfires this summer, as we also saw in France, Spain, and Portugal this year as well. What you can see here, I guess, are two forms of data visualization, and both of the tasks that we're setting you as part of this hackathon involve visualizing data in some way. You'll be given the choice of two different tasks, by the way, but we will come on to that shortly. On the top right here, we've simply got some satellite data and animation of satellite data using NASA's WorldView website. So Victor talked a little bit about Sentinel Hub, which is the European Union's Copernicus data from satellites. This is, I suppose, the American equivalent from NASA. All of this data is freely available and quite easy to interact with as well. These are fires burning in the Arctic Circle in Russia, about 68 degrees north. Some of the biggest fires on the planet burn at these latitudes through the boreal forest of Russia. And some of my work has been looking at these fires at high latitudes. And this other data visualization on the bottom left here, I don't have a great experience in coding, by the way. I built this visualization using Tableau, which I think is a really powerful tool for students who are not well experienced with coding their own visualizations. But what you can see here is a candlestick diagram, or a flame diagram, as I like to call it. And we're going through the years 2003 to 2020. And what you can see here is each year's fire activity building up. But if you look north of the Arctic Circle, so to the right of this diagram, you see the years 2019 and 2020 being pretty shocking, because we don't really see much activity north of 68 degrees, but in 2019 and 20, there was a huge spike in fires. And we do think that this has got something to do with the warming of those latitudes much faster than the rest of the planet, and the drying out and thawing out and then drying out of the soils at these high latitudes. But just as Victor explained for droughts, fire is not just a function of the weather and climate. It's useful to think about fire in terms of an organism. That's how I like to describe fire. It's like ecology, and we can talk about the distribution of fires on our planet being the pyroecology of our planet, or the ecology of fire, or pyrogeography. And if we think about trees or plants, and we've got a map here of plant life on Earth, we can see that they're distributed where, one, there's resource availability. That means appropriate soils, appropriate sources of nutrients. We also need physiologically appropriate environmental conditions. So that might be the weather. It needs to not be too hot, not too cold. And there also needs to be sufficient rainwater to feed the plants. But also there needs to be some way for them to reproduce and disperse and spread. So, and here we can see a typical distribution of plant life, where we have lots of rain, lots of nutrient availability in the tropics. And then, of course, we have the desert regions without plants. But if we think about fire, it's very similar. For a fire to have, the distribution, the geography of fire, we need to have flammable vegetation. So that's the resource availability. There needs to be stuff to burn, otherwise you're not going to have a fire. You also need to have appropriate fire-conducive weather patterns. And so, again, it needs to be dry some time of the year. And there are places on our planet that are wet all through the year. So it's very rare that you see fire. And also, finally, you could treat dispersibility as something to do with ignitions as well. And of course, naturally, fires are started by lightning. It's pretty much the only source of ignition in the natural world, alongside volcanoes, but that's very rare and quite specific to certain regions. But now humans make up 90 to 95% of all ignitions. So again, got to consider the fact that fire-conducive weather patterns are influenced by climate change, but both the flammable vegetation and ignitions are heavily controlled by human activity in terms of land management practices on the ground. So here we've got a map of the distribution of fires, which unsurprisingly doesn't look too different to the distribution of vegetation, apart from some anomalous places such as the Congo Basin and the Amazon and parts of Southeast Asia. And the reason why we don't see fires here, despite there being lots of stuff to burn, lots of flammable vegetation, is that simply these regions are a bit too wet for there to be fire. So let's think about climate change and pyrogeography, because it's not just the weather that's changing with climate. So the weather is important for determining where we have fires, because we know temperature is changing, we know the distribution of rainfall is changing. That's going to affect relative humidity. And we also know that the winds are going to be changing as a result of these changes in temperature distribution. So we know fire weather is going to change with climate change, but also the fuel that's available on the ground is going to change with climate change as well. For a start, we're seeing bigger and faster growing plants than we did before the Industrial Revolution, because CO2 in our atmosphere is a fertilizer, and it helps speed up photosynthesis. And actually all of that extra growth in vegetation on the ground is equivalent to all of the loss of vegetation that we've seen from deforestation since the Industrial Revolution, which is really quite incredible. We're also going to see changes in moisture and changes in growing seasons, which also affect the amount of fuel or the amount of vegetation that we have on the ground for wildfires. Finally, we don't know really anything about how climate change is going to affect lightning. It's a real kind of area of uncertainty in climate science. So the natural distribution of ignitions is changing, but also just to touch on peat fires, which are fires that happen in soils. These are also probably going to become more likely, especially in the Arctic regions, because of warmer temperatures can sometimes ignite peat without the necessary spark to spark a fire. So I'm going to start talking about some of the things that you might see if you explore the data from the EFIS service, the European Forest Fire Institute, EFIS. Some of the layers that are available, some of the time series data sets that are available use this particular system. This is called the Fire Weather Index, and it was developed by the Canadians in the 1960s and 1970s to try and give an indication of the likelihood of severe fires based on simple kind of meteorological input. So at the top here, you can see fire weather observations, temperature, humidity, wind, and rain, both in the short term on the left and the longer term on the right, because both the long-term weather and the short-term weather determine whether you're going to have a fire ignite, but then the short-term weather determines whether that fire is going to really spread quickly or not. So you can see here that these meteorological variables feed into these indices that relate to different parts of the vegetation structure. So on the left, we can see the fine fuel. So that would be the needles from pine trees or the leaf litter on the ground from the previous growing season, very fine fuels that might ignite. And then you've got duff, which is kind of the mushy stuff on the surface just above the soil, but below the recent leaf litter. And finally, we've got something called the drought code. And this is only affected by very long-term changes in both temperature and rain. So hot and dry for long periods will affect the drought code. Now, these contribute to what's called the build-up index, which is essentially, you know, an indicator of built-up stress in the system. And like with earthquakes, fires are, you know, a very quick release of energy after the build-up of stress for a long time, and that's what the build-up index responds to. And the initial spread index is related very much to wind, and that determines whether a fire is going to take off or not, and that's very much about short-term weather. And finally, all of these kind of indices come together to represent the fire weather index. Generally, the higher the value of these indices, just an example here, the initial spread index, the higher the rate of spread of the fire. And often it's a kind of exponential relationship between these two. And with climate change, the initial spread index is a function of temperature, relative humidity, and rain and wind. With higher temperatures, with low relative humidities, which is what we're expecting to see in European summers, particularly in Northern Europe, we're going to expect higher numbers in this particular index. That's going to lead to the faster spread of fires, which leads to exponentially large fires, but also more difficult fires to fight. A faster fire is much harder to fight than a slower fire, obviously. Now, 13 years ago, this really important paper came out in PLOS One, which tried to predict what fire distributions would look like in the future. With climate change, we expect to see fire activity decreasing in some places because it's going to get wetter, or there's going to be less vegetation to burn as a result of stress on vegetation from climate change. And we're going to see places with increasing fire activity. Now, across most of Northern Europe and Western Europe, by the time that we are in right now, we are in the middle of this prediction period. We expect to see more fires, and I think we're already seeing that. But also, if we look at the highest latitudes, so northern Norway, northern Sweden, and Greenland, again, this paper predicted an increase in fire activity by the decade that we are currently in. And of course, this is playing out in reality. These are fires on Greenland. This is a fire in 2018, I think, on the left here, just located on the western coast of Greenland. And you can see the fires detected from space on the right here in this zoomed out image. Some of my work has been looking at where these fires are happening and on what type of soil type, because I'm very interested in peat. Some of you might know that peat is a really important store of carbon. And when it's frozen, it also stores lots of bubbles of methane. And we're very worried about this in the Arctic because, one, the peat is thawing out, it's drying out, and is now being available to burn. And that sends carbon from the soil into the atmosphere quite dramatically. And secondly, those methane bubbles stored in the peat, especially when it thaws out, and especially when there's a fire burning over the surface, those methane bubbles can be released into the atmosphere. Methane is a strong greenhouse gas. So what you can see here is a data visualization. Well, it's a bar chart, but it's still a form of data visualization of fires in the north of the Arctic Circle on the left, and beyond the tree line on the right. So these are fires in the tundra ecosystem, beyond the boreal forest. And 2019 and 2020 were really quite unusual years. We thought 2019 was an anomaly, but then 2020 came along, where you see double or treble the activity in a typical year in these latitudes. But what I was really interested in was combining the fire data sets with soil data sets to find out how many of these fires, or how much of the energy burning in these fires, which is what the y-axis is in these plots, is actually burning on peat. And again, we can see about half of these fires are on peat soils, which is somewhat worrying. So we put this together for a paper in Nature Geoscience a couple of years ago, led by Jessa McCarthy at the University of Florida, and Merit Turetsky at the Polar Research Institute. But looking further forward in time, if we look towards the end of this century, the same paper made predictions, for different periods of decades, and you really see a very bright red mark here for Northern Europe, Western Europe. And I'm particularly interested in the UK. It's where I'm from, and I work a lot with UK fire and rescue services. And we do have a problem. This is 2019, and you can see here fires burning across the United Kingdom, in the Peak District in England, North Wales, South Wales, the Lake District, Scottish Highlands. And if we look over to Northern Ireland, there are fires in the Mourne Mountains and also in Western Northern Ireland as well. So this is a really dramatic picture. The red spots are the fire detections from space, and then you can actually see the smoke plumes coming off these fires. This smoke plume, affecting cities like Manchester and Liverpool downwind of this major fire. We're beginning to see the need for the use of aerial attack in the UK for the first time. We see that frequently in Spain, Portugal, France, Greece, in the Mediterranean countries, but we're beginning to see the need for this now in the UK as well. And this wildfire featured for the first time in the UK Climate Change Risk Assessment in 2021, and I contributed to this chapter. And in this chapter, we started talking about some of the efforts that are being made in Mediterranean countries in Europe well, and they've been made for a number of years now, for decades, to kind of separate the flammable vegetation from the urban interface, make sure that people have, well-adapted homes, risk reduction. And unfortunately, this came a little bit too late for this year. This year, most of Europe and the UK broke their hottest temperature on record, mid-July 2022. And for the first time, this is me appearing on Sky News, and this is Wellington in Greater London, where for the first time we saw fires spreading from the kind of rural areas into the built-up areas of the UK. And the UK lost in excess of 150 properties during those fires, which is the first time we've ever seen the loss of a single property from a wildfire in the UK. To lose 150 was quite shocking. So just a few more visualizations to give you some inspiration, because I'm about to start the most important part of today's session, which is the introduction to the tasks. This is a visualization by someone working on a project that I'm on, the UK Fire Danger Rating System. So what you can see here is 22 years worth of data in a spiral diagram. We can see the months of the year, and we can see periods of time where there has been high fire weather index, that index that I introduced you to at the start of the talk. And this fire weather index is available for the whole of Europe, for different spaces, different places, different countries, through the link that we provided you already in the email, and I'll talk through some of that in a minute. But you can see here that the 19th of July 2022, which was the hottest day of the year, saw the biggest spike in fire weather index that we'd ever seen since records began. And so it was no surprise that we saw devastating wildfire activity on that particular day, and that was the most damaging day as far as the building losses were concerned. And fortunately, there was no one hurt, and still to this day, no one has died in a wildfire in the UK, at least in modern times. Just some more here. This is actually taken from the EFIS website, which again, one of the potential data sources for your project. So you can see here, whilst 2022 didn't beat the 2019 record for burnt area, we did see the highest number of fires in 2022, most of those occurring in July. And again here, this is actually breaking down the number of fires by different kind of land uses. Really interesting to see that England has a very different distribution of fires. We tend to have summer fires, whereas most of the other nations of the United Kingdom have fires in the spring rather than the summer, mostly in kind of heather grassland. And many of those fires are set on purpose for land management purposes. So just a little bit about the project I'm working on. It's developing a fire danger rating system. France already has one. Spain has one. Greece has one. Most of the Mediterranean countries have a fire danger rating system. The UK doesn't. So that's one of the projects I'm working on, to try and turn some of these data sources into a kind of predictive system for how fire might behave in the UK, where we have quite unique fuels. It's not just forests, it's not grasslands like we see in the Mediterranean. We also have the shrub fuel types, which are quite typical of Northern European countries, and trying to understand what the fire risk is in those ecosystems is quite important.